In this Dantesque scenario, where women enjoy the privilege of not being held accountable for what they do and say, and as a result, the opposite sex is the first to suffer, men have no choice but to find another solution, their own emancipation. This means learning as many skills as possible so that men depend as less as possible on others, bringing out the best in themselves and not the worst, always in comparison and in competition with themselves and never with others, and above all, never in comparison with the opposite sex, seeing accountability for their bad behavior not as an obstacle to their development, but as an indispensable foundation for their growth. Realizing that in the three possible situations that the individual faces, in terms of having more possibilities to succeed, the one in which they are in the best position to achieve what they want is the one in which they depend solely and exclusively on themselves and not on others, either totally or partially. Realizing in this logic that individualism, the school of thought that puts the individual first in relation to others, is not what it's defamatorily said to be, that is, pure selfishness, but rather the real escape route to success and to independence, without this meaning any harm to the community. Individualism is binary and manipulatively judged within the framework of a dichotomy, individual-community, in which the primacy given to one of these elements necessarily means the weakening of the other and vice versa. And, in this particular case, being the primacy given to the individual, society will inevitably be weakened. And that is why individualism promotes or is itself selfishness for those who think this way. In fact, individualism should not be understood from a dichotomous perspective, but rather from a paradoxical perspective, that is, in a relationship where both sides mutually strengthen each other, in the healthy battle they have against one another, in the assertions that each of these elements makes against the other. In other words, as Nietzsche reminded us, remembering the thinking of Heraclitus, contrary to what happens in dichotomies, in paradoxes, one of the elements is not weakened by the strengthening of the other, and vice versa, but each one of them is strengthened in the battle they have between them, in the assertion that each one of these elements makes of itself in the battle where they fight against each other. And for that reason, in the paradoxical relationship between the individual and society, society not only weakens with the strengthening of the individual, but it also strengthens itself with the strengthening of the individual, and vice versa, if the mutual affirmation of both elements in this paradoxical relationship occurs in an alternating and intermittent manner. Therefore, contrary to what is ideologically and manipulatively said, individualism is not the negation of society, just as the individual is not its opposite, but part of it. And for this reason, the more the individual strengthens itself, the more society is invigorated and revitalized, because although they are two different things and not the same thing, they are umbilically interconnected. What it seems to me is that, knowing this and not being unaware of this, the supporters of collectivism and strong opponents of individualism and everything that breeds freedom could never not want to destroy everything that wants to escape their mechanisms of ideological control. And collectivism, like a good wolf in sheep's clothing, is an ideological mechanism of control, which as such has a very difficult coexistence with freedom, even when it is used wisely. Individualism, by suggesting that individuals need to take responsibility for their actions, it puts paradoxically the laws of the community above the individual. While collectivism, by not demanding that accountability, is devaluing the laws and the rules of the community, which they say they protect more than anything, putting individuals above it. And by doing that, we see the great contradiction of the collectivists. Consequently, the idea of men looking for their own emancipation will inevitably have to do with their search for self-sufficiency, where they bring out the best in themselves in order to depend as less as possible on others, as true self-made men do, assuming the responsibility for their choices and the consequences of their actions. This will necessarily involve the idea that human beings are unfinished beings, and their emancipation will thus be the realization of an existential life project that is understood, as the Greeks understood it, to be fulfilled in the fullness of being oneself, presupposing the inevitable need for each person to know who they truly are and what they were made for, their diamond, their potential, and thus take control of their life, seeking to extract as much as possible from themselves what they know best how to do, and fulfill themselves in the success of this process and in the happiness associated with it, without ever expecting any recognition or congratulations from anyone, yet taking full responsibility for what they do and say, without childishly seeking scapegoats to absolve themselves of responsibility, either for their failures or for their inappropriate conduct. Men must, as never before, free themselves both from the bonds that tie them to women and from the blackmail that women carry out, to their benefit and to the detriment of men as a result of this male dependence. The emancipation of men is the weapon they have, at their disposal, available to combat female toxicity and any and all blackmail that comes from women by taking advantage of the situation of dependence that men have in relation to them. But if, on the one hand, it's up to men to emancipate themselves from women, on the other hand, it's also up to women, if they truly want to be emancipated, to free themselves from the chains of those who want to control them, whether it be the feminists, the elite corporations, or the left wing and the centrist parties, that these same corporations control. If women want to be emancipated, they must free themselves from the chains of feminism and from the chains of pseudo-revolutionary, that is pseudo-libertarian, narratives of the left and center parties, which do nothing but manipulate, deceive, and exploit them against one of the hating groups, both of the left and of the elites, men.